The rain that changed everything. The rain drummed steadily against the window panes of Maple Diner, creating a rhythmic melody that mingled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of coffee cups. It was an ordinary afternoon in the quiet outskirts of Denver, where life moved at a predictable pace. Rachel Hughes, a waitress with 7 years of experience at Maple Diner, moved through the establishment with practiced ease. Her black and white uniform, a little worn at the seams, felt like a second skin. The air carried the familiar aroma of fresh coffee and warm maple syrup, comforting scents she had known for years. She had no reason to believe that today would be any different from the thousands that had come before it. That was until the doorbell jingled, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. Rachel turned, napkin in hand, and her heart nearly stopped. The face was older, sharper, refined by time and experience, but she would have known him anywhere. Christopher Mansfield, a name she hadn't spoken in years, a name that had once been synonymous with friendship, dreams, and heartbreak. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself, willing her mind to catch up with her racing pulse. The last time she had seen Christopher, they were teenagers, huddled under the golden porch light of her childhood home, whispering promises they were never able to keep. He had been her best friend, her closest confidant, and in the quiet corners of her heart, perhaps something even more. And now he was here. And he wasn't just here, he was famous. Rachel had read about him in passing, seen his name in glossy magazine articles that adorned the checkout lines of grocery stores. The real estate maverick, they had called him. The millionaire with a Midas touch. Yet in this moment he wasn't a distant success story. He was standing in her diner, scanning the room as though searching for something, or someone. Her. Their eyes met. For a split second, there was no diner, no rain, no customers sipping their coffee in oblivion. There was just Rachel and Christopher, standing across from each other, as if the past had unraveled to bring them back to the same place. She swallowed hard, barely finding her voice. Chris? His lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across his face before soft recognition took its place. Rachel. The echoes of the past. Rachel's mind reeled. How long had it been? 10 years? 11? She had spent years wondering what had become of him, where he had gone, why he had never reached out after the letters stopped coming, after the phone calls went unanswered. And now he was here, looking just as stunned as she felt. A waitress cleared her throat beside her, snapping Rachel out of her daze. The diner was still bustling, customers still waiting for their meals. Rachel straightened, her professional instincts kicking in despite the maelstrom of emotions brewing inside her. "Table for one?" she asked, keeping her voice as even as she could manage. Christopher hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, table for one." She led him to a booth near the window, the very same one where she used to sit on her breaks, writing out song lyrics in the margins of her order pad. She watched as he removed his coat, his tailored suit crisp even after the rain. He had always been tall, but now he carried himself differently, more composed, more self-assured. Rachel handed him a menu, though she doubted he needed one. "Coffee?" she asked. He smiled slightly, as if the request pulled him back to a time long ago. "Black. No sugar." The familiarity of the moment hit her square in the chest. She nodded and turned toward the coffee station, willing herself to breathe. Her hand shook slightly as she poured his coffee. Was this real? Could it really be him, here, after all these years? As she walked back, she found him watching her, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite place. "You still working here?" he asked, accepting the cup she placed in front of him. The question stung more than she wanted to admit. "Yeah," she said simply, offering no elaboration. Christopher stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, though he hadn't added anything to it. "I didn't think I'd find you here. I mean, I hoped, but I wasn't sure." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You were looking for me?" He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, a gesture that felt achingly familiar. "Yeah," he admitted, I was. Her heart did a strange little flip at the confession. Why? He hesitated, as if he wasn't sure how to answer. Rachel wasn't sure she was ready for whatever answer he had anyway. A friendship forged in music and dreams. They had met as children, two lonely souls who found solace in music. Rachel had grown up in a modest home on Maple Street, the eldest of 3 kids in a family that had more love than money. Her father, George, was a mechanic who had injured his back when she was 16, rendering him unable to work. Her mother, Linda, took extra tutoring jobs to make ends meet. Rachel, in turn, had picked up shifts at Maple Diner, postponing her own dreams to help her family. Christopher had moved to the neighborhood in 4th grade. He had been shy, almost painfully so, living with his widowed mother in a small townhouse 2 streets down. His father had died in a car accident when he was just 7, leaving behind a hollow that no amount of time could fully fill. They had bonded over music. Rachel played piano and sang. Christopher had a voice that could hush a room. Together, they had filled school auditoriums with their harmonies, their voices weaving stories only they truly understood. They had promised each other that one day they would make it big. That nothing, not money, not circumstances, would keep them from their dreams. But dreams had a way of getting lost in the harsh light of reality. And now here they were. The weight of the years. Christopher sighed, setting his coffee cup down with a soft clink. I know we lost touch. I know I. He stopped, shaking his head. I should have done better, Rach. Rachel inhaled deeply, willing herself not to let the old pain rise. Yeah, she said softly. You should have. A shadow crossed his face, a flicker of guilt. She didn't want to be cruel. She had thought about this moment for years, wondered what she would say if she ever saw him again. But now that he was sitting in front of her, looking at her like no time had passed, all she felt was exhaustion. She had spent too long missing him. She wasn't sure she had it in her to do it again. Why now? She asked finally. Why come looking for me after all this time? Christopher's gaze locked onto hers, something unreadable in his eyes. Because I never forgot you, he said, his voice quieter now. Because some things, some people, they never really leave you. Rachel felt her throat tighten. She wanted to believe him, but she wasn't sure if she could. The unfinished song. Rachel stared at Christopher, her fingers tightening around the coffee pot she had yet to return to its station. His words, because I never forgot you, hung in the air between them, charged with a weight she wasn't sure she could bear. For a moment, she wanted to believe it, wanted to believe that in all the years since they had parted, in all the places he had gone, she had somehow remained a constant in his mind. But the rational part of her, the part that had spent nights wondering why he never called, why the letters stopped coming, wasn't ready to surrender to nostalgia just yet. Rachel let out a small breath and forced a half smile. That's a nice sentiment, Chris. But words don't change what happened. Christopher's expression flickered with something close to regret. He shifted slightly in his seat, leaning forward, elbows resting on the table. I know, he admitted, and I don't expect them to, but that doesn't mean I don't want to try. Rachel studied him carefully, unsure how to respond. The man sitting across from her looked so different from the boy she had once known. The Christopher Mansfield she had grown up with had always been full of nervous energy, constantly shifting his weight from foot to foot, always a little unsure of his place in the world. But this Christopher, he radiated confidence. He sat still, composed, entirely in control of himself. There was a gravity to him now, a certainty in the way he spoke, the way he carried himself. This was a man who had built something from nothing. But that didn't mean she wasn't still hurt. Rachel, he said softly, breaking through her thoughts, would you be willing to have dinner with me tonight? No expectations. Just to catch up properly. She hesitated. Everything inside her screamed that she should say no, that she shouldn't let herself fall back into his orbit. But there was another part of her, a quieter part, buried deep under years of disappointment, that wanted to hear him out. That part won. "Fine," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "But only dinner." Christopher's lips curled into a small, almost relieved smile. "Only dinner," he agreed. Rachel nodded, wiping her hands on her apron as she stepped back. "I get off at 7. You can meet me here." "I'll be here," he promised. And for some reason, this time, she almost believed him. The ghosts of yesterday, the hours between their conversation, and the end of her shift stretched impossibly long. She moved through the diner in a daze, taking orders, refilling coffee cups, wiping down tables, but her mind wasn't in the present. It was trapped in memories. Memories of Christopher sitting beside her on her parents' porch, strumming his old guitar, their voices weaving together in harmony. Memories of stolen moments between shifts at the garage where her father worked, where Christopher would wait for her after school, offering her a ride on his rusty old bike. Memories of the last night they had spent together before he left, the way his arms had wrapped around her, how tightly he had held on before whispering, "Don't forget me." She hadn't, and that was the problem. By the time 7 o'clock rolled around, Rachel had changed into a simple blue dress and brushed through her hair at least 5 times, willing herself to feel less nervous. Celia, her manager, caught her by the counter as she clocked out. "You okay, hon?" the older woman asked, crossing her arms. "You've been quiet all day." Rachel gave her a weak smile. "I'm fine. Just a long day." Celia studied her for a moment before nodding. "If you say so. But if this has anything to do with that handsome stranger from earlier, just be careful, all right?" Rachel swallowed. Celia had always been perceptive. "I will," she promised. As she stepped outside, the Denver evening air greeted her with a crisp chill, the rain from earlier having left the pavement dark and slick. And there he was, leaning casually against a sleek black car that looked painfully out of place in the diner's small parking lot. "Right on time," Christopher said, flashing her an easy grin. Rachel rolled her eyes, but she couldn't quite keep the smile from tugging at the corner of her lips. "Let's get this over with," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Christopher chuckled and opened the passenger door for her. "I'll try not to take that personally." A world apart, Rachel had expected him to take her to a simple restaurant, maybe a quiet cafe or a diner like hers. She was wrong. The moment they pulled up in front of Harrington Suites, she nearly choked on her own breath. "This isn't just dinner," she said, turning to glare at him. This is a 5-star rooftop restaurant." Christopher had the audacity to look amused. And I'm wearing a $20 dress I bought on clearance." He laughed, genuinely, shaking his head. "Rachel, you could walk in wearing a potato sack, and you'd still outshine everyone in there." She felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment. Still, the extravagance unsettled her. This wasn't her world. It had never been. But as she stepped out of the car and followed him inside, she realized something else. This was his world now, and she wasn't sure she would ever fit in it. The past and the present collide. Dinner started off surprisingly normal. They talked about small things, music, old friends, the way Denver had changed over the years. But as the meal went on, Rachel could feel the conversation shifting. "So," Christopher said, cutting into his steak, "what happened to your music?" Rachel stilled, her fork halfway to her mouth. She had been waiting for this question, dreading it. "I grew up," she said simply. "Life happened." Christopher frowned. "That's not an answer, Rach." She sighed, setting her fork down. "I had responsibilities. My dad got hurt. My mom was struggling. My brother enlisted. My sister needed help with college. Music didn't pay the bills." Christopher's jaw tightened. "But it was your dream." Rachel forced a smile. "Dreams don't always pay rent, Chris." For a moment, he was quiet. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled something out, sliding it across the table toward her. A small gold pendant. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. It was the same baseball bat charm he had given her the night before he left. "You still have this," she whispered, her fingers brushing over the tiny piece of jewelry. Christopher's eyes softened. "I never let go of it." Rachel swallowed hard, emotions clogging her throat. He was making it too easy to fall back into old feelings. Too easy to remember the boy she had once loved, and too easy to forget that he had left, that he had moved on, and that she had no idea where this road was leading them. Between two worlds, Rachel sat in stunned silence, the tiny gold pendant resting in her palm. The weight of it was almost nothing, but in her heart, it felt like the heaviest thing in the world. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet Christopher's gaze. "You kept this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Christopher nodded, his expression unreadable. "I never forgot where I came from, Rachel, or who was there with me before everything changed." Rachel exhaled, her fingers tightening around the pendant. Memories flooded back, each one tinged with the bittersweet ache of time lost. The night he had given it to her, the night before he left, had been one of the hardest nights of her life. She had clutched that tiny charm as if it could keep them connected, as if it could keep him from slipping away. But he had slipped away. And now here he was, years later, sitting across from her in a five-star restaurant, still holding onto a piece of their past. She wasn't sure whether that made things better or worse. She cleared her throat, willing herself to push past the lump forming there. "So why now?" she asked, placing the pendant gently back on the table. "Why come back now, after all these years?" Christopher hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "Because I realized something," he admitted. "I built this whole life, this career, this success, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really mattered. And I started wondering if maybe I lost something else too." Rachel's heart pounded. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he was here for more than just a nostalgic walk down memory lane. But belief was a dangerous thing. "Chris," she said carefully, choosing her words, "I spent years wondering why you stopped calling, why the letters stopped. And now you show up in my diner and act like we can just pick up where we left off. It's not that simple." "I know," he admitted, leaning forward. "And I don't expect it to be. I want a chance, Rachel. A chance to make things right." Rachel studied him, searching for any sign that this was some passing whim, but all she saw in his eyes was sincerity. And that terrified her. The world he lived in now. As they left the restaurant, the tension between them was palpable. Christopher led her to his car, opening the door for her. "I want to show you something," he said as he slid into the driver's seat. Rachel frowned. "It's getting late." "It won't take long," he promised, starting the engine. She hesitated but eventually nodded. "All right." They drove through the streets of Denver, the city lights stretching out before them like a sea of stars. The farther they went, the more unfamiliar the surroundings became. Finally, they pulled up in front of a massive gated estate. Rachel's eyes widened. "This is the Harrington estate," Christopher confirmed. Rachel's breath caught. They had stood outside this very mansion when they were kids, staring through the iron gates, dreaming of a future that had seemed impossible. Now Christopher was driving through those gates like he belonged there. Rachel felt an odd pang in her chest. This was his world now. As they stepped out of the car, the grandeur of the estate was overwhelming. Marble fountains, manicured gardens, a driveway lined with luxury cars. A small gathering of elite business figures stood in the front courtyard, sipping champagne and exchanging quiet conversations. Rachel swallowed hard. She had never felt so out of place. Christopher, however, moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting people with polite nods and handshakes. Rachel stayed close, feeling like a shadow. Then a sharp voice called out, "Christopher." They both turned. A woman was approaching, tall, striking, and poised with the kind of effortless confidence that only came from old money. Her dark red gown shimmered under the estate lights, her long, polished nails wrapped around a crystal wine glass. Rachel immediately recognized her from the restaurant. Angela. Christopher's jaw tightened slightly, but he managed a polite smile. Angela. Angela's gaze flickered toward Rachel, assessing. And who is this? This is Rachel, Christopher said smoothly. An old friend. Something in the way Angela's lips curved upward sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. Old friend, Angela repeated slowly, as if testing the words. How? Interesting. Rachel forced a tight smile. Angela turned back to Christopher, her voice lowering. We need to talk. Alone. Christopher hesitated, glancing at Rachel. It's fine, Rachel said quickly. I'll just take a walk. Christopher's eyes softened with gratitude. I won't be long. Rachel nodded and wandered toward the garden, inhaling the cool night air. But she couldn't shake the unease curling in her stomach. Something about Angela's presence felt wrong. And the way Christopher had reacted to her wasn't lost on Rachel. The threat of secrets. Rachel wandered through the garden, trying to clear her mind. But the longer she stood there, the more uneasy she became. A few minutes later, she heard voices drifting through the hedge-lined path. She recognized Christopher's voice. And Angela's. Rachel knew she shouldn't eavesdrop. But something about Angela's tone made her pause. You're making a mistake, Angela was saying. This deal with Harrington, it's bigger than you realize. Christopher's voice was sharp. I know exactly what I'm doing. Angela scoffed. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're putting your entire empire at risk. And for what? Some noble cause. Affordable housing. Please. Rachel stiffened. There was a pause. Then Angela's voice softened. You could have had everything, Christopher, she murmured. You and I. We were good together. We could still be good together. Rachel's heart clenched. Christopher's voice was quiet but firm. That was a long time ago, Angela. I've moved on. Angela let out a soft laugh. Have you? Silence. Rachel turned away, her stomach twisting. She didn't need to hear more. Christopher had told her he wanted to make things right, that he had come back for her. But was that really true? Or was she just another loose end in a world he had long since outgrown? She didn't want to wait around to find out. By the time Christopher returned to the garden, Rachel had already made up her mind. I should go, she said before he could speak. Christopher frowned. What? Why? Rachel forced a smile. I don't belong here, Chris. Rachel. Good night, she said softly, turning before he could stop her. And as she walked away, she realized something painful. Christopher Mansfield had come back into her life like a storm. But storms didn't stay. They only left destruction in their wake. The storm that follows. Rachel walked away from the grand estate with her head held high, but her heart was pounding. Each step she took felt heavier, like she was trudging through the thick fog of memories she thought she had buried long ago. The night air was cool against her skin, but it did nothing to ease the heat of emotions rising in her chest. The conversation she had overheard between Christopher and Angela replayed in her mind, every syllable dripping with a meaning she wasn't sure she wanted to decipher. You and I, we were good together. We could still be good together. Had Christopher really moved on? Or had she just walked into a story that had already been written without her? She didn't know. All she knew was that she needed to get out of there. She barely made it past the security gates before Christopher caught up to her. Rachel, wait. His voice was breathless, urgent, and for a moment, she wanted to stop. But she forced herself to keep walking. Rachel, please. Something in his tone, something raw, something desperate, made her hesitate. With a sigh, she turned to face him. Chris, I can't do this. His brows furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. Do what? This. She gestured vaguely toward the mansion behind him. Your world. Your past. You're. She exhaled sharply. Angela. Christopher stiffened. This isn't about Angela. Rachel let out a hollow laugh. Isn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it sure feels like it. His jaw tightened, frustration flashing in his eyes. She doesn't mean anything to me, Rachel. Rachel searched his face for any sign of dishonesty, but she found none. That didn't make it any easier. I don't know what I'm doing here, Chris, she admitted, crossing her arms. I don't belong in this world. I don't belong in your world. That's not true, he argued. You were always a part of my world, Rachel, even when we were apart. She let out a breath, shaking her head. I don't know if I can believe that. Christopher ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. Then let me prove it to you. Rachel hesitated, torn between the part of her that wanted to run and the part of her that wanted to stay. Finally, she settled on the truth. I need time, Chris, she said softly. His shoulders slumped slightly, but he nodded. Take all the time you need. And just like that, she turned and walked away. Again. The weight of the past. Rachel spent the next few days throwing herself into work, hoping that keeping busy would keep her thoughts from drifting back to Christopher. It didn't work. Celia noticed. You've been scrubbing that counter for 10 minutes, sweetheart, she pointed out one afternoon, raising an eyebrow. Rachel blinked, glancing down at the spotless surface beneath her hands. With a sigh, she set the rag down. I just have a lot on my mind. Celia gave her a knowing look. Let me guess. Tall, handsome, and the kind of trouble that sneaks up on you. Rachel huffed a laugh, shaking her head. Something like that. Celia leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. You know, I've been around long enough to know when someone's running from something. Rachel frowned. I'm not running. Celia tilted her head. Aren't you? Rachel opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. Because maybe Celia was right. Maybe she was running from Christopher. From what he represented. From the fear that if she let herself believe in him again, she'd only end up getting hurt. Celia softened. Look, I don't know the whole story, but I do know this. If you spend your life hiding from what scares you, you're gonna wake up one day and realize you let something real slip through your fingers. Rachel swallowed hard, her fingers instinctively brushing against the gold pendant still hanging around her neck. She hated that Celia was making sense. The breaking point. That night, Rachel sat in her small apartment, staring at her phone. Christopher hadn't texted, hadn't called, hadn't shown up at the diner. She had told him she needed time. Maybe he had taken that to heart. Maybe he had decided she wasn't worth waiting for. The thought made her chest ache in a way she wasn't prepared for. Before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed her phone and dialed his number. It rang once, twice. Then, Rachel? His voice was rough, like he had just woken up, and the intimacy of it sent a shiver down her spine. She hesitated. Did I wake you? There was a small chuckle on the other end. Not really. Just, wasn't expecting to hear from you. Rachel swallowed. Yeah. Well, I wasn't expecting to call. A beat of silence stretched between them. Can I see you? She finally asked. Another pause. Then softly. Always. A dangerous truth. Rachel met Christopher at a quiet park just outside the city, the moon casting silver light across the grass. He was already there when she arrived, leaning against his car with his hands in his pockets. He looked tired. More than that, he looked worried. Rachel frowned as she approached. Chris, what's wrong? He let out a slow breath. I need to tell you something. She nodded, waiting. Christopher exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. It's about Harrington. Rachel stiffened. What about him? Christopher hesitated, then looked her straight in the eyes. He's trying to destroy me. Rachel's stomach dropped. What do you mean? She whispered. Christopher shook his head. The deal we were working on, it's falling apart. And Harrington isn't just backing out. He's making sure I can't recover. Rachel's mind reeled. But why? Because I wouldn't play his game, Christopher said bitterly. He wanted to cut corners, raise property values beyond what people could afford. I refused. And now he's making sure I pay for it. Rachel felt cold. What are you going to do? Christopher hesitated. I don't know. A silence stretched between them. Then Rachel stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. You're not alone in this, Chris. His eyes softened, something breaking in his expression. You don't have to. I want to, she interrupted. Christopher let out a shaky breath. I don't deserve you, Rachel. She smiled, a small, sad thing. Probably not. He huffed a laugh, shaking his head. But I'm not going anywhere, she continued. No matter what Harrington throws at you. Christopher's gaze locked onto hers, something raw and real passing between them. And for the first time in a long time, Rachel realized something. She wasn't running anymore. She was choosing to stay, even if it meant facing the storm with him. Even if it meant risking her heart, because Christopher had come back into her life for a reason. And maybe, just maybe, this time, he was here to stay. Rachel stood beneath the flickering glow of the park's lamplight, her hand still resting lightly on Christopher's arm. She could feel the tension coiled in his muscles, the frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He was in trouble. Real trouble. And for the first time since he had walked back into her life, she saw just how much weight he had been carrying on his shoulders. Christopher ran a hand through his hair, his gaze dark with something that made her stomach twist. I knew Harrington was ruthless, but I underestimated how far he'd go to get what he wants. Rachel frowned. How bad is it? He exhaled slowly, looking out over the empty park as if trying to gather his thoughts. Bad. The smear campaign is already in motion. He's painting me as a corrupt investor, someone who manipulated property values to increase my own profits. The media's eating it up. My investors are spooked. He shook his head. If I don't find a way to counter this, Mansfield Ventures could collapse in a matter of months. Rachel's heart clenched at the raw honesty in his voice. The Christopher Mansfield she had known as a kid had always been a fighter. He had clawed his way out of poverty, built something from nothing, and chased success with a relentless determination. But now he looked like a man who had just been backed into a corner. Rachel swallowed hard. What can I do to help? Christopher turned to her, his eyes softening for the first time that night. Rachel, you don't have to. I want to, she interrupted. For a moment, he just stared at her, something unreadable in his expression. Then, slowly, his lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. You always were stubborn, he murmured. She smirked. You're just figuring that out now. He let out a breath, shaking his head. You being here, standing by me, that means more than you know. Rachel wasn't sure what it was about those words, but they settled deep in her chest, warming a part of her that had been cold for a long time. She had spent years thinking she had lost Christopher Mansfield. Maybe she had never really lost him at all. A dangerous proposition. Christopher drove Rachel home that night, but neither of them spoke much. There was something brewing beneath the surface, something unspoken, something delicate. When they pulled up in front of her apartment, Christopher turned to her, hesitating. I meant what I said, you know. Rachel raised an eyebrow. About what? That I don't want to lose you again. Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay grounded. Chris, we don't even know what this is yet. He nodded, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. I know, but I'm not going to let time or distance get in the way this time. I'm not going anywhere. Rachel exhaled, studying him carefully. She had spent so long convincing herself that he was a ghost from her past, that their chapter had already been written. But maybe this was a new beginning. Still, she wasn't ready to make promises she couldn't keep. Good night, Chris, she said softly. He nodded, understanding. Good night, Rachel. She climbed out of the car, walking up the stairs to her apartment without looking back. Because if she had, she wasn't sure she would have been able to walk away. Harrington's next move. The next morning, Rachel arrived at the diner feeling restless. The events of the previous night played in her head on a loop, and no matter how hard she tried to shake them, she couldn't escape the feeling that something bad was coming. She had seen it in Christopher's eyes. The worry, the exhaustion, the desperation, and now she was wrapped up in all of it. She was wiping down a table when Celia came up behind her. "Hey, you might want to take a look at this." Rachel frowned as Celia slid a newspaper onto the table in front of her. Her stomach dropped. The headline read, "Real estate mogul Christopher Mansfield accused of fraud. Former partner speaks out." Rachel's hands tightened around the edge of the paper as she scanned the article. It was brutal. The piece painted Christopher as a reckless businessman who had manipulated markets for his own gain. It quoted James Harrington extensively, framing him as the concerned investor who had been forced to cut ties with Christopher due to his unethical practices. Rachel's blood boiled. She knew it was all lies. She had overheard Harrington threaten Christopher. She had seen firsthand how much Christopher cared about the communities he was trying to build. And now, Harrington was trying to destroy him. Rachel pulled out her phone and dialed Christopher's number. He picked up on the first ring. "You saw it," he said. Rachel clenched her jaw. "Chris, what are we going to do?" There was a pause. Then his voice came through the line, quiet but firm. "I have a plan." A dangerous gamble. That evening, Rachel met Christopher in his downtown office. The space was modern, sleek, but it didn't have the corporate coldness she had expected. The walls were lined with photos of real estate projects, many of them affordable housing developments, just like the one Harrington had been trying to sabotage. Christopher was standing by the window when she arrived, staring out over the city skyline. "You have a plan?" she asked, stepping inside. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Angela came to me this morning." Rachel tensed. "What?" Christopher nodded. "She's willing to help." Rachel's stomach twisted. "Chris, you can't trust her." "I don't," he admitted. "But she has information. Proof that Harrington's been falsifying numbers, that he's been the one manipulating the markets, not me." Rachel frowned. "And she's just giving this to you?" Christopher sighed. "Not exactly. She wants something in return." Rachel crossed her arms. "Of course she does. She wants me to back out of the deal entirely. She thinks if I step away, Harrington will let this all blow over." Rachel stared at him. "And are you actually considering that?" Christopher clenched his jaw. "I don't know. If I back down, I save my company, my employees, my reputation. But if I fight, I don't know how ugly this could get." Rachel inhaled sharply, the weight of his words sinking in. Christopher had spent his whole life fighting to build something, and now, in the span of a few weeks, he was being forced to decide if it was worth risking it all. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Chris, what do you want to do?" His eyes met hers, something conflicted flickering behind them. "I want to do the right thing," he admitted. "I just don't know if I have the power to win this fight." Rachel squeezed his arm gently. "Then let's find a way to make sure you do." For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then, finally, something in his expression shifted. Determination. Resolve. "Then let's bring Harrington down," Christopher said. Rachel nodded. Together, they were going to fight. No matter what it took. The truth unraveled. The risk of doing the right thing. Christopher and Rachel sat in his office, the hum of the city beyond the glass windows a stark contrast to the storm raging inside. The choice before them wasn't simple. It was a gamble that could either restore Christopher's legacy or destroy him completely. Angela's offer was tempting. If he backed away from the deal, Harrington might relent. He could protect his company, his employees, and his future. But at what cost? Rachel crossed her arms, her brows furrowed in concern. Chris, are you sure she has the proof? Christopher exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. She showed me some documents. Emails. Internal reports. It's damning stuff. Rachel frowned. Then why not go public with it? Leak it to the press. Because, Christopher said bitterly, Harrington has more influence than I do. Even if I expose him, he'll find a way to spin it. He's been playing this game a lot longer than I have. Rachel hated how true that sounded. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Then what if you don't fight him in the public eye? Christopher looked at her curiously. What do you mean? She leaned forward. We find someone bigger than Harrington. Someone with enough authority to make sure his influence doesn't protect him this time. Christopher's expression darkened. Rachel, we'd be going up against one of the most powerful real estate moguls in the country. She met his gaze, unwavering. You already are. A dangerous game. Angela agreed to meet Christopher again, this time under far more secretive circumstances. They arranged a private meeting in an upscale hotel suite downtown. Christopher brought Rachel along, much to Angela's displeasure. The suite was lavish, with city lights stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Angela, draped in an emerald green dress, lounged in one of the high-end chairs, swirling a glass of wine as she watched them enter. Ah, you brought company, she mused, giving Rachel a cool smile. How charming. Rachel ignored the obvious tension in the air. Christopher got straight to the point. You said you have enough evidence to bury Harrington. I want to see it all. Angela tilted her head, amusement flickering in her eyes. And why would I hand over my leverage so easily? Rachel narrowed her eyes. Because you want to see Harrington taken down. And you know that Chris is your best shot at making that happen. Angela smirked. I do enjoy a woman who speaks her mind. She set her wine glass down and pulled out a small flash drive from her clutch. Everything you need is on here. Financial records, wire transfers, manipulated property values. It's more than enough to implicate him. Christopher reached for the flash drive, but Angela pulled it back at the last second. Not so fast, she murmured. I need something in return. Christopher's patience was thinning. What do you want? Angela leaned back, tapping the flash drive against her palm. A partnership. Once this is over, I want a stake in Mansfield Ventures. Rachel tensed. Are you kidding? Angela barely spared her a glance. I'm offering you the key to destroying Harrington. I expect something in return. Christopher was silent for a moment. Rachel could see the war going on behind his eyes. Angela's offer was dangerous, but without her evidence, they had nothing. Finally, Christopher exhaled. I won't give you ownership, but I can offer a collaboration, mutual investments in future projects. That's the best deal you're going to get. Angela studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. Fine. But if you betray me, Christopher, I will make sure you regret it. Christopher didn't flinch. Right back at you. Angela handed him the flash drive. Happy hunting. The first strike. Back at Christopher's office, Rachel and Christopher plugged in the flash drive and scrolled through the files. Rachel's jaw tightened as she read through the documents. Wire transfers to offshore accounts. Fake property value assessments. Bribes to city officials. It was worse than they had imagined. This isn't just fraud, Rachel murmured. This is criminal. Christopher nodded grimly. If this gets into the right hands, Harrington won't just lose his empire. He could go to prison. Rachel hesitated. Do you think Angela knew that? Christopher smirked humorlessly. Of course she did. She's playing a long game, same as us. Rachel exhaled. Then we need to be smart about this. Christopher tapped his fingers against the desk. We need a journalist. Someone who won't back down, even if Harrington tries to kill the story. Rachel's mind immediately went to someone. I know just the person, she said. The journalist who could bring it all down. Rachel reached out to Olivia Carter, an investigative journalist she had met years ago, when Olivia was covering a workers' rights case. They had kept in touch sporadically, but Rachel knew Olivia was one of the few reporters with the courage to go after someone like Harrington. Olivia agreed to meet them in a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town. She was sharp-eyed, dressed in a simple blazer and jeans, her dark hair pulled back into a bun. She eyed Christopher with mild interest before turning her attention to Rachel. "So, what's so big you needed to drag me out here at 8 in the morning?" Olivia asked, sipping her black coffee. Rachel slid the flash drive across the table. "Everything you need to take down James Harrington." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold claim." "Take a look," Christopher said simply. Olivia plugged the flash drive into her laptop and scrolled through the files. Rachel watched as her expression shifted from skepticism to shock. "Holy shit," Olivia breathed. She looked up, her journalist instincts already kicking in. "This is a massive scandal." Christopher nodded. "The question is, are you willing to run it?" Olivia smirked. "Oh, I don't just run stories like this. I blow them wide open." Rachel felt a spark of hope. They had the evidence. They had the journalist. And soon, the world would know exactly who James Harrington really was. The calm before the war. That night, Rachel sat with Christopher in his office, the weight of everything pressing down on them. They had set the wheels in motion. There was no turning back now. Rachel glanced at Christopher, who was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" she asked softly. He let out a slow breath. "I don't know." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "This could destroy everything I've built." Rachel reached for his hand, squeezing gently. "Or it could be the start of something better." Christopher studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Rachel felt her heart flutter in her chest. No matter what happened next, whether they won or lost, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't walking away this time. And neither was he. The reckoning. The story breaks. 2 days later, the world changed. Rachel stood in the middle of her apartment, the TV remote clutched tightly in her hand as she watched the broadcast. The words scrolling across the screen sent a thrill of nervous energy through her veins. Breaking news. James Harrington, under NVE ist JJ for FRA2T, BRI, and illegal business practices. The anchor's voice was steady but urgent. This morning, investigative journalist Olivia Carter published an explosive expose detailing the illegal financial practices of real estate mogul James Harrington. The article, backed by undeniable evidence, reveals a complex web of fraudulent activity, offshore accounts, and political bribery, all designed to manipulate the housing market and maximize profits at the expense of low-income communities. Rachel's heart pounded as the screen cut to a clip of Olivia outside a courthouse, surrounded by reporters. Mr. Harrington has long been a dominant figure in the real estate industry, but the evidence brought forward raises serious legal and ethical concerns. Prosecutors have confirmed that they are launching an official investigation into the allegations. If found guilty, Harrington could face severe legal consequences, including possible jail time. Rachel exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest. They had done it. They had exposed him. She grabbed her phone and dialed Christopher's number. He picked up on the first ring. "Did you see it?" she asked breathlessly. "I saw it," he said, and she could hear the relief in his voice. "It's everywhere, Rachel. He can't run from this." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting it sink in. "Are you safe?" Christopher hesitated. "For now. But I don't think Harrington's going down without a fight." Rachel swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" "I mean he's got powerful allies, people who don't want to see him fall. And right now, I'm his biggest problem." A chill ran down Rachel's spine. "Chris, you don't think he'd—" "I don't know what he'll do," Christopher admitted. "But I need to be ready." Rachel clenched her jaw. "Then I'm coming to you." Christopher started to protest, but she cut him off. "I'm not asking, Chris. I'm coming." There was a pause. Then, finally, he sighed. "All right. Meet me at my office." Rachel grabbed her keys and left without another word. The threat becomes real. By the time Rachel arrived at Mansfield Ventures, the city was buzzing with the fallout from Olivia's article. News vans were parked outside the building, reporters swarming the entrance. Rachel managed to slip through a side door, taking the elevator up to Christopher's office. When she stepped inside, she found him standing by the window, staring down at the chaos below. "Looks like the world's finally paying attention," he murmured, turning to her. Rachel crossed the room, resting a hand on his arm. "Are you okay?" Christopher sighed, rubbing his temple. "I should be relieved, but something doesn't feel right." Rachel frowned. "What do you mean?" Christopher gestured toward the television mounted on the wall. A press conference was underway. James Harrington stood at a podium, his expression carefully measured. "This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to discredit me," Harrington declared, his voice smooth and controlled. "These allegations are entirely baseless. Christopher Mansfield has always been an ambitious businessman, but it appears that in his desperation, he has resorted to slander and deception." Rachel's hands curled into fists. "This man is lying to the public," she hissed. Christopher's jaw tightened. "He's scared. He wouldn't be doing this if he wasn't afraid of what's coming." Then Harrington said something that sent a bolt of ice down Rachel's spine. "I have no doubt that the truth will prevail. And rest assured, we will be pursuing legal action against Mr. Mansfield for defamation and damages." Rachel turned to Christopher in alarm. "He's suing you." Christopher exhaled sharply. "He's trying to stall, to intimidate me." Rachel clenched her teeth. "Chris, what if?" A knock on the door interrupted her. One of Christopher's employees, a nervous-looking young man, poked his head inside. "Sir," he said hurriedly, "there's someone here to see you. A lawyer from Harrington's team." Christopher and Rachel exchanged a look. "Let them in," Christopher said evenly. A dangerous proposition. The man who walked into the office was tall, impeccably dressed, and carrying a leather briefcase. His expression was unreadable as he took a seat across from Christopher. "My name is Richard Klein," he said smoothly. "I represent Mr. Harrington." Christopher leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I figured." Richard folded his hands. "Mr. Harrington is willing to settle this matter privately." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," Richard said, looking directly at Christopher, "that if you agree to retract your statements and publicly discredit Olivia Carter's report, Mr. Harrington will drop all legal actions against you and Mansfield Ventures. In addition, he's prepared to offer a financial settlement." Christopher didn't even blink. "And if I refuse?" Richard sighed, as if he were dealing with a stubborn child. "Then you can expect a drawn-out legal battle that will drain your resources, damage your reputation, and potentially cripple your company." Rachel felt fury rising in her chest. "You're trying to bully him into silence." Richard barely spared her a glance. "It's business." Christopher studied the lawyer for a long moment. Then, slowly, he leaned forward. "Tell Harrington I have a counteroffer." Richard raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Christopher's expression darkened. "Tell him to go to hell." Richard blinked, clearly caught off guard. Rachel smirked. "I think we're done here." Richard's jaw tightened as he rose to his feet. "Very well, but don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and strode out the door. As soon as he was gone, Rachel let out a breath. That was a mistake. Christopher shrugged. "Maybe. But I'm not letting that man scare me into silence." Rachel studied him. Despite the weight of everything pressing down on him, there was something steady about Christopher now. Something unshakable. For the first time, she truly believed that he wasn't just fighting for his company. He was fighting for something bigger. For justice. For the people who couldn't fight back against men like Harrington. For himself. For them. The fallout. Over the next several weeks, the battle intensified. Harrington's legal team filed lawsuits, But Christopher's attorneys countered every move. Olivia's article continued to gain traction, forcing regulatory agencies to launch deeper investigations into Harrington's business dealings. And then, finally, the FBI stepped in. With enough evidence to warrant a full criminal investigation, Harrington's empire began to crumble. His assets were frozen, his allies abandoned him, and his name became synonymous with corruption. Christopher had won. They had won. Rachel stood beside him the day the news broke. "I can't believe it's over," she murmured. Christopher turned to her, something unreadable in his gaze. "It's not over." Rachel frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated before reaching for her hand. "I meant what I said, Rachel. I don't want to lose you again." Rachel's breath caught. For years, she had wondered if Christopher Mansfield would ever come back into her life. And now, here he was, standing before her, offering her something she had never truly let herself hope for: a future, a second chance. She squeezed his hand, her heart pounding. "You're not going to," she whispered. And this time, she meant it.